Today, I'm taking a look at what I believe to be the best use for acrylic paint markers. In fact, this may be the only use for these markers. It's definitely the only way that I will use them. Now, acrylic paint markers are definitely not designed to be a one-to-one replacement for more conventional painting supplies. However, when used properly, they can be a powerful tool in your painting arsenal. Welcome to Treehane Miniatures. I've already produced a video where I conducted a full battery of tests for these exact markers, which I'll link to in the description below. I tested the markers using a variety of painting techniques. I evaluated the markers' strengths and weaknesses based on how they performed in each application. I found that these markers perform best for base layer applications and would be most valuable when used in a base shade highlight approach to miniature painting. So that's what we're doing today. I picked up a set of 18 markers from Amazon for around $10. I wasn't expecting much from these budget markers, but they absolutely blew me away with their single coat coverage. Today I'm painting a horde of zombie walkers from Zombicide Black Plague. I'm also happy to report that the markers worked flawlessly for all 35 zombies and they're still going strong. Before going to town with the acrylic markers, I need to prime all 35 miniatures. When batch painting, I like to prime the miniatures with a prominent color found on the miniatures. The common color for all of these undead sculpts is a pale flesh tone. I'm choosing Rust-Oleum Camo Khaki to represent the undead flesh on these zombies. When painting large batches of miniatures, I prefer to limit my color palette to 3 colors per sculpt, excluding the primer color. These zombie walkers consist of 5 different sculpts, each with 7 copies. I'll paint these walkers in sets of 7 and use only 3 different markers for each set of 7. Limiting my color palette will help the painting progress faster. Since I know that I'm going to use a dip wash for the final step of this process, I'm choosing colors that are a step or two brighter than what I'd normally choose for the mid-tone colors of these dingy medieval zombies. Any type of overall wash tends to stain the underlying acrylic colors. This will darken the appearance of the initial color, add shadows to the recesses, and make the model look more weathered overall. I went a bit off script for the dip wash this time around, ditching my preferred antique walnut finish in favor of something darker. This makes for an interesting screw up at the end, but that's why I experiment with this stuff, so you don't have to jeopardize your minis experimenting on your own. I'm using the acrylic paint markers to establish the base layer for every color on all 35 miniatures. My expectations for these markers are that they may not last for all 35 miniatures. Even if the amount of paint in the marker is adequate, I fear that the tips may dry to the point that the marker is useless. I'm also worried about the integrity of the marker tip holding up under the abuse of speed painting 35 miniatures. When testing these markers, I painted a highly textured miniature and a mostly smooth miniature. The texture on the first miniature broke down the tip of the marker significantly. There isn't much flex to these marker tips, so the impact of a highly textured surface really takes a toll on the fine pointed tips. Let's begin by discussing the obvious strengths of these markers, which is how much faster batch painting is with these. The speed and flow of these markers is incredibly impressive. No matter how fast I swipe the tip across the miniature, I get complete coverage. There seems to be just one level of layer thickness from these markers, regardless of the application speed. The paint doesn't pull or leave brush strokes when moving slowly, nor does it skip areas when moving fast. The paint's opacity also doesn't appear to be affected by the underlying primer color. This is an overwhelming positive since we're looking for complete opacity in a single coat. These miniatures have fairly smooth features, so I'm not noticing the marker hanging up on any of the details like it did when I was painting a more textured model. Also, there are no deeply recessed features on these miniatures. The long tip of the marker is more than sufficient to reach all of the details of the model. However, if I needed to reach past obstructions to paint more remote parts of the model, the width of the pen itself would pose a serious issue. The body of these paint markers is significantly thicker than any standard brush handle. I watched a Ninjan video where he tests AK Interactive acrylic markers. I was very surprised to hear him say that using these markers for base layering isn't as fast as using a standard paintbrush. He pointed out that the paint flow of AK Interactive acrylic markers limited how fast he can paint with them. He stated that it was much faster to use a fully loaded paintbrush for base coating a miniature. Based on my experience with these Sunny paint pens, I couldn't disagree more. First of all, as I stated earlier, the flow from these Sunny markers is outstanding. I don't feel restricted at all by how fast the paint is coming out of the markers. In fact, the paint flow is so consistently adequate that I would only use these for painting the base layer. Trying to highlight with these markers would be an exercise in futility. There really is no way to dial back the paint flow no matter how fast I paint with them. I won't be able to achieve fine highlights as I would normally like to do. These pens produce a consistently wide band of color. Even some of the small details, like belts, can be a challenge with these markers. It's nothing that a little shade wash can't clean up, so I consider using these markers for base layering to be a complete success. Second, the absolute game changer with these markers is that I never have to clean or reload my paintbrush. Prior to getting started, I didn't fully comprehend what a game changer this would be. It's fairly obvious that I'd save time by not having to deal with the hassles of using a standard paintbrush, but this isn't the only way in which these pens save time. The uninterrupted workflow results in a zen-like state. It's very easy for me to develop a pattern for painting these identical miniatures as I quickly move from one to the next. I'm able to briskly move over the surface of the entire miniature without ever having to pause and then pick up where I left off later. This results in a higher level of focus on a singular task that ultimately results in faster workflow. This just feels so much different than batch painting with a standard paintbrush. It's much less tedious. At no point during the painting process did I experience any clogging, tip drying, or reduction in paint flow. This is surprising to me. I had initially planned to have some airbrush flow improver on hand to keep the marker tips from drying. I imagined that occasionally dipping the marker tip in a little flow improver would be necessary to keep things flowing. At no point was this needed. I'm very impressed by these low-budget markers, and I'm so glad that I got them for this paint up. Batch painting miniatures has always been such a tedious process for me, and one that I dread. I am not saying that these paint markers make painting 35 crappy miniatures fun, but they definitely make it less painful. And honestly, this is the only type of painting that I'd use these markers for. If I were painting a single miniature, I would always prefer a standard paintbrush, even for the base layer. The only real perk of acrylic paint pens is their time-saving aspect. That becomes less relevant when painting a single miniature. Plus, these paint pens can't compete with the precision of a fine-tipped paintbrush. I can achieve a multitude of different paint strokes with a single standard brush. I can vary the width of the stroke from ultrafine to medium thick. I can use a variety of paint consistencies from thick base layer consistency to the perfect translucent glaze or color filter. These paint markers lack this kind of nuance. This highlights another limitation of these markers, which is they aren't suitable for highlights. The lack of ultrafine paint control means that any highlights will be in the form of a fairly wide band of paint. Not ideal for the kind of detail that highlights require. Also, the jumps in hue are pretty dramatic from one color to the next. This means that any attempts at layering may look more like colored stripes on a piece rather than subtle changes in brightness of the midtone color. Standard hobby paints are preferred here because we can always mix intermediate colors as we progress from shadow colors to our highlights. These paint pens have their strong suits, but their limitations are real. And despite their limitations, acrylic paint markers are invaluable for batch painting miniatures. When painting with the base shade highlight method of speed painting, the base layer step is the most time consuming. Being able to knock out the base layer quickly is a great way to jumpstart a batch painting session. The remaining steps to finish off these miniatures are a breeze to complete. These paint pens only come in one opacity, which is fully opaque. If I want to use a translucent color or effect, I'll have to look elsewhere. For these zombie walkers, I'd like a little blood effect on their wounds and rotting flesh. I decide to use army paint or glistening blood for this. I dot this into open mouths and any wounds found over the miniatures. This glistening blood is fairly bright and pink when going on, but it will be darkened by the wash later. As I mentioned earlier, these acrylic paint markers aren't suitable for highlighting a miniature. The tips on the markers are nice and sharp, but the generous paint flow doesn't allow for the precision necessary to achieve fine highlights on such small objects. Since this is such a large batch of inconsequential miniatures, I'm choosing to highlight with a single off-white color and a dry brush. Ice yellow is my color of choice. I started with a makeup brush and then switched to a goat hair dry brush, which I feel works better for this application. The pale yellow is a stark contrast to the more vivid colors of the color scheme, but this too will get darkened significantly by the wash that follows. The final step of the process is to apply a shade wash. I'm choosing to employ the dip wash method. Since I'm dealing with such a large batch of miniatures, this will make the process go faster. I'm using Minwax Ebony Polyshade. I first tried this wash when looking for a black panel line wash to jumpstart painting in a comic book style. The brown undertones found in this dark wash made it unsuitable for that purpose, but I really liked the dark brown shadows it provided. What I forgot about that first attempt is that I had first sprayed the miniatures with a clear gloss varnish before dipping them. I did this because I only wanted the shade in the recesses as a starting point for blacklining the miniature in a comic book style. Having a poor memory means that I didn't use gloss varnish on these particular miniatures. This results in a little more surface staining than I would have liked, but this isn't a deal breaker since these are medieval zombies that haven't bathed in over a year. Still, I prefer my usual dark walnut poly shade over this ebony version, and it's what I'd recommend as a dip wash without hesitation. The end result is perfectly fitting for a horde of undead walkers, but it's not a shade that I'd use on everyday miniatures. I'd like to thank my amazing channel members for supporting what I do on this channel. You too can become a channel member for as little as $1.99 per month using the link below, and receive perks such as early access to videos, extended versions of our painting tutorials, and even a tier that lets you decide which miniature I paint next. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of army dippers.